The ontological argument goes back, I don't know how far, but the most far back that you need to go in your exam writing is to the 11th century. All the way back to the 11th century, a guy called Anselm of Canterbury. But you know that, don't you? This is a revision video. Everyone remembers Anselm and Annie at the weekends, but that was strictly off the record. Nobody actually knows about that. You heard it here first. Anyway, Anselm had this idea of God being the greatest possible being. We'll get into that in a second, but first of all, what do you need to know in your introductory paragraph, whatever the question is, somewhere in the beginning you need to say the following. Ontos is Greek for being, and the idea is that God, his being, necessarily involves existence. Existence is just part of who God is. It's part of his being. So we have ontos meaning being and the ontological argument. So the earliest formation of this argument comes from Saint Anselm of Canterbury. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Two main works of Anselm, two main batches of writing. You've got Monologion and Proslogion, and in the first of those, Monologion, he was writing about atheists and agnostics and trying to show that necessarily these guys, atheists and agnostics, were wrong, and trying to appeal to reason, trying to show to people who look on those with faith as unreasonable, trying to prove to those people that actually faith is a reasonable approach. It's rational, it's totally rational. And then when you get into the Proslogion, he's writing more to believers really, and in fact the ontological argument that you find there is written in the form of a prayer. So Anselm's writing to God, if you like, but actually he's writing as if to God, so that people can hear what he's saying, or he's writing to God but wants other people to hear what he's saying, so they can hear his thoughts. But they're the two main pieces of work. So in the first of his two works that we're going to talk about, Monologion, we don't really need to say too much about that, but it's useful to know that Monologion, which was written more to do with converting atheists, or at least convincing atheists that faith was reasonable. In Monologion, he's saying that everybody has desires. We've all got desires, and we desire things that we consider to be good. And if we desire things that we consider to be good, then we've got a concept of goodness. And in fact, we can rank goods. You can rank goods in order of goodness. And because of that, Anselm argues that without God, we couldn't do that, because all the good things, and good things like truth, justice, nobility, all those sort of good, virtuous things. And if you've studied Plato, you can see that he was influenced by Plato a lot here. In fact, you could say he's totally Platoized his ideas here. He's taken ideas of good, justice, truth, and all that, and saying, well, all of those are found in God. And the ability to rank ideas of goodness in order comes from God. So because we've got that sense of goodness, sense of what is good, that must have come from God, so God must exist. So all of that is in Monologion. But the second thing that's most important to look at really is what is said in Proslogion. Bet you can't wait. So in Proslogion, that's where things kind of get a bit more tricky for a lot of people. What you've got to first get your head round is, for the ontological argument, is the idea that God is, and here we go with that quote, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. You should be familiar with that by now. This is a revision video. But you can't improve on God, and you can't conceivably, in your mind, you can't imagine being able to improve on God. You can't imagine anything better than God. He is the most perfect, amazing, greatest being. Nothing greater than God could possibly exist. And that is the definition of God that we start with. it either just sounds like a jumble of words to you, or after a while it starts to sound like it makes sense. And it does make sense, but it's just not our natural way of speaking. I don't know if it was in his day or if he just had this quirky way of thinking and writing. It's certainly quite difficult reading proslogion today, that's for sure. Anyway, so what he tries to say now is that once we've defined God as the greatest possible being, we can't conceive of a being greater than God. We then move on to say even the atheist can agree that that's the definition. The atheist will agree that that's the definition of God, just in order to dismiss God's existence. So if you're going to say you don't believe in something, you've got to define the thing you don't believe in order to say you don't believe in it. I can't say I don't believe in flibbity flobs unless I define what flibbity flobs are. So if I say I don't believe in God, if I say I'm an atheist, I've got to define God. And Anselm uses that definition: God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. He's the greatest possible, greatest conceivable being, as his starting point for the atheist to dismiss the existence of God. The Bible says the fool has said in his heart there is no God. But what Anselm is doing now is saying even a fool would agree that that's a fair definition of God. So if the fool admits that God, if he existed, God would have been this greatest possible being, we now have established that God exists in the mind. He exists in the understanding. Now, Anselm treats the mind as if it's a physical place. If you think of it like that, it kind of helps to understand, for me anyway, it helps to understand the ontological argument a tiny bit better, certainly Anselm's version of it. If you think of the mind as a place, or the understanding as a place, you've now thinking about the idea of a God that is greater than anything else that can be conceived. You've got this concept of God, and he now exists in your mind. So even the fool, who has accepted that that's the definition of a God that may or may not exist or does not exist, we now have God existing in the mind of the fool. But if God is the greatest possible being, the question is, what's greater, to exist just in the mind, the place of the understanding, or to exist in reality as well? Now, Anselm uses the idea of a painter who has a painting, but before he paints that thing, or she paints that thing, the thing that they're going to paint exists in the mind. All right, so first of all, let's imagine that the painter is going to paint a vase of flowers. How cliched, but yeah, let's have a nice vase of flowers that the painter is going to paint. And the painter has the vase of flowers that exists in his mind first. Let's imagine they're not even using a reference point at the moment, because we're not thinking of the vase of flowers, we're thinking of the painting, all right? So he's not using a reference. He's not, by reference, I mean he's not copying an actual vase, he's not copying a picture. All he's got is a picture in his mind. So that picture exists in his mind only, but then he paints it. And now the picture exists in reality on a piece of paper or canvas. Which is greater? The first one, the one that exists in the mind of the painter, or the actual finished product that exists in reality? Well, obviously Anselm wants us to say, and it's true, the greater, most beneficial painting is the one that exists in reality. People can look at it, they can touch it, they can hold it, they can buy it, they can sell it, they can put it on a wall. It's a painting, it's not just in the mind. I mean, I'm sure lots of essays that you've written have just ended up existing in the mind and never existed in reality. And your teacher will agree that it's better for the essay to exist in reality, however poor it is, than, although some of the essays I've read, it would have been better if they just stayed in the mind. But most essays, it's better that they exist in reality. So that's the distinction we need to make, because Anselm then wants to draw that distinction to the idea of this being, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Because the thing about God is, he's got greatness in his definition. We've just agreed that God is greater than anything you can conceive by definition. So if he's the greatest possible being by definition, and he only exists in the place of your understanding, then he's not the greatest possible being. So in order for him to be that greatest possible being, he has to exist not just in the mind, like the painting. He needs to exist in reality as well, not just so that we can look at him like a painting, but so that he can fulfill his own definition. Because by definition, he's the greatest possible being. And while he's just existing in the minds of fools, atheists and believers, he's not the greatest possible being. For him to be that greatest possible being, he's got to exist in reality. Therefore, God exists by definition. His existence is necessary. And you can quote me. One way of approaching the topic is to just give all the arguments for the existence of God ontologically, and then give all the arguments against. But sometimes they need to interact with one another. You need to go for and against, for and against. Sometimes I find that a little bit easier. And in this case, we're just going to go a little bit chronological, and we're going to deal with the instant criticism that came from a guy called Gaunilo of Marmoutiers, and he was a contemporary of Anselm. That means he lived at the same time, and they actually swapped letters a few times, and Anselm was pretty generous to him about Gaunilo's criticisms, because Gaunilo was saying, well, what I'm going to do with you, Mr. Anselm, my chum, both Christians, both believe in God, what I'm going to do with your idea is I'm going to replace the idea of God with the most perfect island. And I'm going to test your logic, but I'm just going to take God out of the equation and I'm going to replace it with a perfect island. So Gaunilo works through exactly the same argument, but instead of saying God, or that than which nothing greater can be conceived, he says a most perfect island. So let's run that through now and see how ridiculous Gaunilo thought Anselm's argument was. And then we'll come to Anselm's responses, and that'll be a nice start for the ontological argument. Then we can look at some other ideas from other people more recently. All right, so Gaunilo says, there is an island which is the most perfect possible island. It's the most beautiful island. An island than which no island greater can be conceived. An island that exists only in the mind that you're now imagining is not as good as an island that exists in reality. So the perfect, most great island that you're imagining, must exist in order to be the greatest possible island. Well, he was quite complimentary about other parts of Anselm's argument, and Anselm wrote back saying, you know what, I'm pleased you like the bits that you like, and I understand you don't like the bits that you don't like and what you've just said. And he was happy. This is probably not essay worthy, but it's just interesting. Anselm was quite happy for Gaunilo's response to be published alongside Anselm's his ontological argument. So that was quite nice. But anyway, there are some responses from that. So you understand the idea. Anselm has said, greatest possible being must exist in order to be the greatest possible being. And Gaunilo said, don't be silly, I could just say that about anything. I mean, you could think of the greatest possible toaster. So I'm not even hungry. To be the greatest possible toaster, it has to exist, because a toaster that exists in the mind is inferior to a toaster that exists in reality. So it's the same logic, but he used the idea of an island. He wrote this as on behalf of the fool. Just thought I'd throw that in. Remember that. Gaunilo, everything Gaunilo said was on behalf of the fool. Because remember, Anselm's addressing the fool, because the fool has said in his heart there is no God, and now poor old fool has been criticised too much, and Gaunilo's called that piece of writing on behalf of the fool. Just thought I'd mention it. So right now, you're probably thinking, well, Gaunilo has wiped the floor with Anselm, and we don't need to believe in God anymore, because he's just proved his argument is stupid. But here we go. Anselm has a response, and his response takes two forms. The first part is just to say that you can't compare God with an island, right? So God, by definition, is necessary. He is a necessary being. You can't compare God with an island. An island is contingent. Remember what the definition of the word contingent. A contingent being is something that may or may not exist and it's probably finite as well. It has a beginning and an end. So an island, the universe can manage without an island, but God is necessary, and he cannot not exist. I'll repeat that. God cannot not exist. His existence is necessary. Don't go comparing God with no island, says Anselm. And the second part will appear on the other side of the screen. The second, see, here I am on the other side of the screen. The second part was to do with the idea that God is immutable. That means he cannot change. There are certain elements, or attributes is a better word, certain attributes of God that are absolutely fixed and unchanging. He cannot change. He's immutable. There's no discussion, no negotiation. God is God, and you can't change what he is. So that is a kind of an objective fact as far as Anselm is concerned. He got a lot of his ideas again from Plato. If you've studied Plato, you should be spotting similarities here and there. The idea of goodness and truth and nobility and all that sort of thing in Monologion, and here as well. The idea of God being just an immovable concept. But an island is subjective, and in fact a perfect island is definitely subjective. So if I would get a whole class to draw or imagine a perfect island, then, well, actually they'd all be different, and your idea of a perfect island might be different from mine. I mean, I would like to see some shade as well as some sunshine, and probably not too much alcohol, if I'm honest. Your idea of a perfect island might be different. It might be hotter, it might be cooler, it might be alcohol fueled, or it might be, if you don't drink, it might be totally non-alcoholic. But your idea of a perfect island will be different from mine, and that is because it's subjective. All right, God, immutable and objective. Islands, well, they could change. I mean, you might think that if I were to get the class to imagine your perfect God, you might all have different ideas of the most perfect God, but Anselm won't have that. He won't. God is unchangeable, immutable. You don't get to choose what the perfect God would be like. God is God. He is greatest, and you won't understand how great he is. He's greater than can be conceived. So you can't say that the idea of a perfect God is subjective. Not to Anselm. He won't have that. God is an objective fact, and he's there. He's unchangeable. So you can do that with islands, but you just can't do that with God. He is by very nature perfect in all his ways, and you can't adjust anything. It's not a subjective fact, it's objective for Anselm. I think I've said enough about that, don't you? Probably too much. Keeping it chronological, the next person to give Anselm a lashing was Aquinas. Aquinas, again, another believer. You'd think believers would stick together, but hey, no, they were ready to have a good old scrap about whether or not they proved God existed or not. So Aquinas had his five ways. All of Aquinas's 5 ways were a posteriori. That's from experience. The teleological argument deals with looking at the world around us and evidence within it. So does the cosmological argument, etc. So they're all a posteriori. But as you will have seen and observed, the ontological argument is a priori, which is prior to experience. It kind of starts with a definition and tries to prove the definition is of something that is real from the first place. Aquinas, not happy with that. No, he's not going to go with that. We've got to be able to observe that. I mean, for Aquinas, people are just too limited and weak compared with God. You know, I'm sure you'd be insulted by that, but compared with who God is and the enormity of who this awesome God is, we're never really going to grasp these things. We're going to need help, so we need to observe things around us in order to believe. So the other thing he didn't really like was this, the idea of starting with his definition, and just really, you can tell that Anselm just assumes God exists from the first place, and the argument is nice for people who have faith already, but it doesn't prove God exists to someone with no faith. That was Aquinas' response. So we've got so far 3 names we're talking about. We've had Anselm, we've had Gaunilo, and now we've had Aquinas. So Anselm's the only one that's really argued, the only one that has argued ontologically for God's existence. And Gaunilo both, Gaunilo and what's he called? He's called Aquinas. They're both Christians, but they both don't like the argument. So that's that. They're the first three names. And the next name is going to be Descartes. Descartes is going to pop up and give us his version of the ontological argument very, very soon. Descartes was obviously that French guy who had some ideas. One of his ideas was that he didn't believe that you could trust the senses enough to use them. So empirical evidence was not the best form of evidence. And so his arguments are going to be a priori, because that's going to use rationalism. Who are we talking about? Descartes. Descartes was a rationalist, okay? So that means he likes to use reason, he likes to use the brain, and so the external senses, well, let's not rely on them too much if we can get away with it. So that's why he's going to like the ontological argument. So here's how his argument goes. Number one, I am thinking about God, and I'm thinking about a perfect God. Then he goes on to argue, and this is where he's a little bit different from Anselm, is he says existence is a predicate of a supremely perfect being. Shall I say that again? Existence is a predicate of a supremely perfect being. Predicate is like an attribute or a quality, all right? So if you were to list all of the qualities of God, a supremely perfect being, you'd obviously be here all night, but one of the things you would be listing would be existence. So you might list love, you might list faithfulness, you might list power, omnipotence, omniscience, those kind of things, attributes of God, of a supremely perfect being. But one of the things you jolly well better reference in that list is existence. So now I've thought about God, point one, and I have said that existence is a predicate of such a perfect being, point two. Conclusion is God has to exist. Again, God necessarily exists, or to put it another way, God cannot not exist. It's a bit like saying the idea of God without existence is like the idea of mountains without valleys. One cannot exist without the other. That's just the way it is. So you better go believe in God, says Descartes, only probably in more of a French accent. Mon Dieu. Well, thank you, Descartes, for enlightening us as to why God exists, because existence is a predicate of a supremely perfect being. You can probably guess that not everybody bought that, and that's why the whole world didn't suddenly believe in God. One of the people who attacked Descartes particularly was Immanuel Kant. Kant had 4 criticisms of Descartes' argument, ontological argument, but it's the 4th one that is probably most famous, and if you're struggling for time or you're struggling for headspace, then latch onto the 4th one. If you are a super student who's going for top grades, then try and bang in all 4 of these. The first one is that we've talked about existence being a predicate. A predicate is a word to describe a word, if you like, in a sentence, like you do in English. If you're saying existence is a predicate in that sentence, well, why not just let's reject the subject of the sentence as well. Reject God as an idea, and then you don't have to give him any predicates at all. So reject the subject, God, and you can reject the predicate as well. So that's his first objection. If you don't get that, don't worry too much. The second criticism from the Immanuel Kant himself was that this argument was just meant to be like an inquiry into the possibility of God existing, but you've just kind of tried to slam dunk the whole existence thing and prove that God exists. It's meant to be an open-minded inquiry, but you've thrown existence in, or snuck existence into the concept. You can't do that. It's not fair. So it's supposed to be an open-minded inquiry. So point one, criticism from Kant. Number one is reject the subject as well as the predicate. Criticism number two, it was supposed to be an open-minded inquiry. You've not been open-minded at all. And the third one is that existential propositions, that's statements to do with existence, need to be synthetic. They need to be verifiable by the senses, and you can't do that with your argument. And the fourth and most famous criticism of Descartes comes in the idea that existence is not a predicate. You know, a predicate is an attribute of something. You can't just say, I'm going to define a unicorn. Now, a unicorn, it looks a little bit like a horse. The one I'm imagining is white, and it's got a horn in the middle of its head, and it has existence, and it's got hooves. Hold on, you can't just throw existence in with a whole list of attributes. If you're going to define something, you're either defining something imaginary or something that exists already, but you can't define it into existence. That was Kant's fourth and I think most powerful criticism, and the most important one for your guys to remember. Okay, so that'll do for now. I shall be in another mystery location next time, and we'll have a look at some more philosophers who've had a go at more modern versions of the ontological argument, and again their criticisms of them. See you in probably a second. Right, so here we are, another day, another dollar. We've so far we've looked at Anselm and we've looked at Descartes, and they're the two earliest proponents of the ontological argument, and we've looked at some of their criticisms. There are other criticisms or people who criticise the argument. Pretty much nothing particularly new in the criticisms. I'll deal with those at the end. I just wanted to go through a few other versions of the ontological argument, and the first one comes from a philosopher called Norman Malcolm. Now, Norman Malcolm deals with the idea that God's existence is either necessary or impossible. Is either necessary or impossible. God is defined as a being whose existence is necessary. If he is the creator, the sustainer of the universe, if he is all-powerful, all-knowing, and he made everything, then he's got to be a necessary being. That's part of his definition. That means he's not a contingent being. Now, a contingent being is one whose existence is not necessary. You could manage without me, for example. The universe would manage without me, this ivy and that foot there. Anything in the world could take it away. I mean, you could even take away the sun and the universe would still exist. It would just look very different in our part of it. They're all contingent beings. They come into existence and they cease to exist. If God doesn't exist now, his existence is impossible. He can't start to exist because he wouldn't be a necessary being. He'd be contingent, which doesn't make sense. So if God does exist now, he can't stop existing. So if he exists, he's always existed and always will. That's what Norman Malcolm is saying. If he's a necessary being, he can't start existing if he doesn't, and he can't stop existing if he does. Norman Malcolm then goes on to say that if God's existence is either necessary or impossible, we're going to just pick the least absurd option. And it's absurd to imagine that God doesn't exist, that this necessary being doesn't exist. It's more likely that he concludes that God must exist. His existence is necessary. The next guy we're going to look at this a priori ontological argument is Alvin Plantinga. Alvin Plantinga. He said that there is a possible world, let's call it W, because we're not creative. Well, if we were creative, we'd call it Planet Banana. There is a possible world in which, in fact, there's a possible world in which there exists a being of maximal greatness. There were two terms that Plantinga used. One was maximal greatness and one was maximal excellence. Maximal excellence means he possesses all the qualities of the classical god of theism, or the god of classical theism: omnipotence, omniscience, moral perfection. Maximal greatness means that he possesses those qualities in every possible world, everywhere. He is of maximal greatness. So Now we've set up the idea of possible worlds. There is a possible world, W, in which there exists a being of maximal greatness. Now, if this being of maximal greatness exists in world W, then it is impossible for him, let's call him him, could be a she, could be an it, but it is impossible for him to exist, to not exist in every other possible world, because by definition he's a being of maximal greatness, which means he exists everywhere. So, if world W was real, then he would have to exist in every world possible. He couldn't not exist. But if he existed in a world that wasn't real, it would still not be possible for him to not exist in every other possible world. So I had to stop the dog barking. I've killed him now. What is necessarily true does not vary from world to world. It's a key point here. What is necessarily true does not vary from world to world. So if it's true in world W, it's true in world X and every other possible world. And the other key point is what is impossible does not vary from world to world. So if it's impossible in world W, it's impossible elsewhere. So if you've got a possible world where God has to exist necessarily, it's impossible for God not to exist in that world. And what's impossible doesn't vary from world to world, then he necessarily exists in our world, in every world. So God exists. Simple, obvious. All right, if you want a neat conclusion, therefore a being of maximal excellence must necessarily exist in every world. Therefore a being of maximal excellence exists in this world. Right, let's have a look at some criticisms now of the ontological argument. Yes, we've seen Gaunilo's perfect island criticism, we've seen Aquinas' criticism, and we've also seen some criticisms from Kant. Well, let's focus now on a guy called John Mackie. He argues in a very similar way to Kant, but he's a bit more modern. He is an atheist, and he wrote this book called The Miracle of Theism. So let's see what Mackie has to say about this ontological argument. Starting with the definition of God that Anselm used, that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. He says that that is a flawed basis for an argument, simply because what you've done is you've made existence to be a predicate, and you can't have existence as a predicate. He goes on to deal with Anselm's idea that it is foolishness to reject the argument. Remember, the fool has said in his heart there is no God. Well, you can't just define things into existence. I could be thinking of a dragon in my head and add existence as a predicate. We've already seen criticisms like this, and it doesn't mean it exists. And this carries on quite neatly from David Hume. He said that thinking something exists doesn't make it exist. And Mackie says exactly the same thing. He says we can reject proslogion 2 on the basis that we can conceive of a being that cannot not exist, but that does not mean that this being actually exists. That's my paraphrase, but that's what he's saying. We can conceive of a being. Oh, I thought I'd killed that dog. Hang on. It was a different dog. That's both dogs killed now. 2 dead dogs in one day. Pretty cool. We are now coming to an end, really. Bertrand Russell also has some stuff to say, as you'd expect. He deals with the idea of existence being a predicate, adding a predicate to something, and then adding something that just makes something greater by existing. He's not happy with that. We're starting to feel a bit... Do you know what? I give up. Idiot dogs. Try and have a peaceful walk. Anyway, I'll come back with a summary of all the main... I'll come back with a summary with all the main characters. Okay, so here's the summary. First of all, you've got Anselm, who said that God was that than which nothing greater can be conceived, and in order to be that great thing, he must exist. That was refuted by Gaunilo, who said that, well, okay, let's think of the perfect island. That was backed up in his criticism by Aquinas, who felt like you needed empirical evidence And Hume also agreed. He said that thinking about something existing doesn't make it exist. But then we can go back to Descartes and say that as a rationalist, it is rational to believe in God because existence is the predicate or a predicate of a supremely perfect being. But Kant didn't like that. In fact, Kant had 4 criticisms, and I recommend you really learn what Kant said in criticism of Anselm and Descartes, because his criticisms do well, but his favourite criticism, or people's favourite criticism he had, were that Kant said that existence is not a predicate of a supremely perfect being. Existence isn't a predicate at all of anything. It's something exists or it doesn't exist, and then it has predicates if it does exist. Finally, not finally, almost finally, we had Norman Malcolm, who believed in possibility and necessity. God necessarily exists because he's not a contingent being, and it's more rational to believe that God does exist than that it doesn't. And the final guy 4 was Alvin Plantinga, who talked about possible worlds, and a maximally great being in any possible world has to exist in all possible worlds, including ours. And then we finished with some criticisms from John Mackey. Go and find out what he said yourself. And if you want to be clever, you can mention Bertrand Russell as well. There are others, but I've given you what I think are the most helpful points for your essay. All the best with that.